The evening started innocently enough. My wife, Hannah, had just come back from a day out with our 3-year-old daughter, Sophie. She had this glow about her, the one that always tugged at my heartstrings. Sophie was busy running around the living room when Hannah said, "Oh, I took the cutest photo of Sophie today. Let me show you." She handed me her phone, smiling, as she leaned over my shoulder to point out the picture. But instead of focusing on Sophie's beaming face in the first photo, my finger accidentally swiped too far left. That's when I saw it. It was a video, grainy, dimly lit, but unmistakable. My heart stopped. A woman with hair exactly like Hannah's, laughing softly as a man's arm wrapped around her waist. The camera angle shifted slightly, revealing enough for me to recognize the room. It wasn't ours. I tried to stay calm, pretending not to notice as I felt her tense beside me. "Oh, I think I swiped too far," I said, handing the phone back casually. "Oh," she stammered, her face flushed. "Yeah, that's just some work stuff. Let me pull up Sophie's photo again." Her fingers moved too quickly, too nervously, scrolling and tapping as if she was scrambling to cover something up. I forced myself to smile, nodding absently as she finally found Sophie's photo and started gushing about her little adventure. But I wasn't really listening. In my mind, I was replaying every frame of that video, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I tucked the thought away, biding my time. Because something about the man in that video didn't just unsettle me, it felt eerily familiar. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way Hannah kept her phone glued to her side, the sudden work meetings that seemed to pop up without warning, the small but noticeable distance that had crept into our conversations. I couldn't shake the image of the video from my mind. And then, late one night while she was asleep, I made my move. Her phone was charging on the nightstand. Normally, she had it locked, but luck was on my side, she'd left it open. My heart raced as I scrolled through her gallery, hoping to find that video. But what I found instead left me cold. There wasn't just one video. There were several. And in one of them, the man turned toward the camera just enough for his face to be visible. It was my son. My son from my first marriage. The realization hit me like a freight train. We hadn't seen him in 2 years, he'd claimed he was working abroad and couldn't visit. And now here he was, in my wife's videos, looking far too close to her. I closed the gallery, placed her phone back on the nightstand, and lay awake for the rest of the night. This wasn't just infidelity. This was something much darker. And I wasn't going to let it slide. The following morning, I woke up before Hannah, my mind still racing with the revelation. She stirred as I got out of bed, smiling groggily. "Morning," she murmured. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "I've got an early meeting. I'll grab breakfast on the way." Her eyes darted toward her phone on the nightstand, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Okay, see you later," she said, pulling the covers up to her chin. I left the house but didn't go far. I parked my car around the corner, hidden behind a cluster of trees, and waited. My instincts told me she'd try to cover her tracks now that I'd seen something. I needed to know how deep the betrayal went. Sure enough, about an hour later, Hannah left the house. She wasn't dressed for work, jeans, a loose sweater, and sneakers. Casual, unassuming. Perfect for blending in. I trailed her at a safe distance, my heart pounding with every turn. She drove across town, pulling into a small cafe. I parked nearby and watched as she sat at an outdoor table, anxiously checking her phone. 15 minutes later, a car pulled up. It was him. My son, Eric. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. He walked up to her, gave her a quick glance around, then leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. They sat down together, talking in hushed tones. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. I took a few photos with my phone, documenting the scene. My chest burned with anger, betrayal, and something darker, a cold, calculated desire for revenge. After about an hour, they left separately. I followed Eric, watching as he drove to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. He parked and went inside. I waited in my car for nearly 2 hours before leaving, my mind churning. Eric was supposed to be working in another country, yet here he was, living out of a motel and sneaking around with my wife. Why? What had he been hiding for the past 2 years? When I got home, Hannah was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. She greeted me with her usual warmth, her smile as disarming as ever. "How was your day?" she asked. "Busy," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "How about you?" "Nothing exciting," she said, shrugging. "Just errands and a bit of work from home." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that it sent a chill down my spine. "Sounds relaxing," I said, my voice even. "By the way, I was thinking of inviting Eric over sometime. It's been so long since we've seen him." She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she forced a laugh. "That's a nice thought, but he's still abroad, isn't he?" "I don't think so," I said, locking eyes with her. "I think he's closer than you realize." Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, brushing it off with a casual, "Oh, really? What makes you say that?" "Just a feeling," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Maybe I'll reach out and see if he's free." Her hand tightened around the knife she was using to chop vegetables, and for a moment, I thought she might cut herself. "Sure, if you want to," she said, her voice strained. That night, after Sophie was in bed, I confronted her. "I need to ask you something," I said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. She looked up from her phone, her expression wary. "What is it? Why were you at the cafe today?" Her face drained of color. "What? I wasn't." "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice cold. "I saw you. I saw who you were with." Her mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. "It's not what you think," she finally said. "Then explain it to me," I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, then sighed heavily. "He's been struggling, okay? He reached out to me a few months ago. He didn't want you to know because, well, you know how your relationship is with him. And that justifies sneaking around with him?" I asked, my voice rising. "It's not sneaking around," she snapped. "He asked for my help, and I agreed. That's all." Her explanation was weak, but I pretended to accept it, nodding slowly. "Okay," I said. "But if it's so innocent, why didn't you tell me?" She faltered again, unable to come up with a convincing answer. "I didn't want to upset you," she said finally. "Right," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. She tried to argue, but I walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I knew she was lying. And I was going to prove it. The next few days were a whirlwind of observation and preparation. I said little to Hannah, keeping things cordial but distant. It wasn't time for a confrontation yet. I needed more. I decided to start with Eric. If he'd lied about working abroad and was now hiding out in a cheap motel, there had to be a reason. I needed to find out what he wasn't telling me. One evening, while Hannah was putting Sophie to bed, I quietly left the house and drove to the motel. Eric's car was parked outside, and the faint glow of a TV flickered through the curtains of his room. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding with anger and anticipation. The door opened slightly, the chain still latched. Eric's face appeared in the gap, his eyes widening in shock. "Dad? Can we talk?" I said, keeping my voice calm. He hesitated, then unlatched the chain and let me in. The room was small and cluttered, with takeout containers and clothes scattered everywhere. It smelled faintly of cheap air freshener and regret. "What are you doing here?" he asked, crossing his arms defensively. "I should be asking you the same thing," I replied. "You told me you were working abroad. Clearly, that was a lie." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to deal with the questions. I needed space, so I told you what I thought you wanted to hear." "Space from what?" I asked, my voice hardening. From everything, he snapped. From you, from Mom, from this family. His words stung, but I didn't let it show. And Hannah? I asked pointedly. He froze, his face going pale. What about her? I saw you with her, I said, my tone cold. At the cafe. I know you've been meeting in secret. So why don't you tell me what's really going on? His eyes darted away, his jaw tightening. It's not what you think, he muttered. Then explain it to me, I demanded, stepping closer. Eric hesitated, then sank onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. It's complicated, he said quietly. Try me, I replied. He sighed deeply, then looked up at me, his expression filled with guilt. Hannah reached out to me, not the other way around, he admitted. She said you'd been distant lately, that she felt alone. She needed someone to talk to, and I listened. My stomach turned. And what else? I pressed. Eric shook his head. Nothing happened. I swear. We just talked. You expect me to believe that? I asked, my voice rising. It's the truth, he insisted. I know how it looks, but I would never. Stop lying, I shouted, cutting him off. I saw the video, Eric. I know exactly what happened. His face went white, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've not only betrayed me but destroyed this family. Why? Tears welled up in his eyes, and for a brief moment, I saw the little boy I used to take fishing on weekends. But the image was quickly overshadowed by the man in the video. I didn't mean for this to happen, he whispered. It just did. I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of rage and heartbreak. You need to leave, I said finally, my voice cold. Pack your things and get out of town. If I ever see you near my family again, there will be consequences. Eric nodded silently, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As I walked out of the motel, the weight of his betrayal pressed down on me like a boulder. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Eric was the first piece of the puzzle, but Hannah was the one who had put it all into motion. And I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. That night, I returned home and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house. It looked so normal from the outside, but inside, it was a house of lies. When I finally went inside, Hannah was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled. You were out late, she said casually. Yeah, I replied, my voice flat. Had some errands to run. She didn't ask any more questions, and I didn't volunteer any answers. As I went to bed that night, I began planning my next move. If Hannah thought she could manipulate and deceive me, she was sorely mistaken. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about making her pay. The days that followed were a masterclass in patience. I kept up the charade of normalcy, acting as if nothing had changed. Hannah, ever the skilled liar, seemed to relax, assuming I had either let my suspicions go or never noticed anything in the first place. But behind the scenes, I was orchestrating her downfall. The first step was accessing her phone. Late one night, while she was in the shower, I slipped into the bedroom and carefully unlocked her device using the fingerprint she'd registered for me months ago. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, photos, and emails, looking for something concrete. It didn't take long to find it. There were texts from Eric. Too many of them. Some were mundane, filled with coded language like, "Can we talk?" and "I need to see you," while others were far more damning. One, in particular, made my blood run cold. "I miss you. When can we be together again?" I sent screenshots of every incriminating message to my email, ensuring I had evidence if she tried to deny it. But the texts weren't enough. I needed something irrefutable, something that would expose the full extent of her deceit. And then I found it, a folder buried deep in her gallery, disguised as work documents. Inside were more videos, more photos. Some were of her and Eric at the cafe, laughing and leaning into each other. Others were far worse. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as the weight of her betrayal threatened to crush me. But I couldn't let my emotions take over. Not yet. I transferred everything to a secure drive, deleted any trace of my access, and returned her phone to the nightstand. By the time she stepped out of the bathroom, I was in bed, pretending to scroll through my own phone. "Long shower?" I asked casually. "Just needed to unwind," she replied, toweling her hair. I nodded, smiling faintly as she climbed into bed. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm and familiar. It took everything in me not to pull away. The following day, I called in a favor from an old friend, Mike, who worked in private security. I told him I needed discreet surveillance equipment, a hidden camera, audio recorders, the works. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a bag of gear and wished me luck. That evening, while Hannah took Sophie to visit a friend, I set up the equipment. A small camera concealed in a decorative clock on the mantel. A voice-activated recorder tucked behind a bookshelf. Everything was strategically placed to capture what I knew would happen eventually. By the time she returned, everything was in place. "Did Sophie have fun?" I asked as she walked in, carrying our daughter in her arms. "She loved it," Hannah said with a smile. "We should visit more often." "Sounds good," I replied, keeping my tone light. For the next week, I waited. Every evening, I reviewed the footage and recordings, combing through hours of mundane conversations and quiet moments. It was tedious, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And then, one night it happened. I was reviewing the latest recordings when I heard their voices, Hannah's and Eric's, clear as day. "I can't keep doing this," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "It's too risky." "You say that every time," Eric replied, his tone dismissive. "But you always come back." There was a pause, then a soft rustling sound. "What if he finds out?" Hannah whispered. "He won't," Eric said confidently. "You're too good at hiding it." I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. They sounded so casual, so comfortable in their betrayal. I copied the audio file and sent it to my secure drive, along with the footage that showed Hannah pacing the living room while on the phone. It wasn't enough to confirm the full extent of their relationship, but it was enough to break the facade she'd so carefully constructed. The trap was set. The following weekend, I suggested we host a family dinner. "It's been a while since we've all been together," I said over breakfast. "Let's invite my parents, your sister, a few close friends. It'll be nice." Hannah hesitated, her eyes flicking toward her phone before she forced a smile. "Sure, that sounds great." "Perfect." Over the next few days, I finalized the guest list, making sure to include Eric. When Hannah asked why, I shrugged and said, "He's still family, even if he's been distant. Maybe this will help bring him closer." She looked uneasy but didn't argue. The day of the dinner arrived, and I played the perfect host, greeting guests with a warm smile and engaging in light conversation. Eric arrived late, looking uncomfortable as he exchanged polite greetings with everyone. Hannah hovered near him, her anxiety palpable. As the evening progressed, I waited for the perfect moment. Once everyone was seated around the table, I stood up, raising my glass. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady. "Family means everything to me, and I'm grateful for all of you." Hannah smiled, her relief evident. She thought I was going to give a heartfelt toast and move on. But I wasn't done. "And because family is so important," I continued, "I believe honesty is the foundation of any relationship. Which is why I think it's time to address something that's been weighing on me." The room fell silent, all eyes on me. "Hannah," I said, locking eyes with her. "Eric. Do you want to tell everyone the truth, or should I?" Their faces went pale, their expressions frozen in shock. "What are you talking about?" Hannah stammered, her voice shaking. I pulled out my phone and pressed play, the audio of their conversation filling the room. Gasps erupted around the table as the truth unfolded, the betrayal laid bare for everyone to hear. Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I should go," He muttered, but I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," I said coldly. "Not until you face what you've done." Hannah burst into tears, her face buried in her hands. The room buzzed with whispers and shocked murmurs, but I ignored them all, focusing only on the two people who had torn my world apart. "You lied to me," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "Both of you. And now everyone knows." Eric pushed past me and fled the house, leaving Hannah to face the fallout alone. But I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The fallout from the family dinner was immediate and brutal. Eric left town that same night. I didn't know where, and I didn't care. Hannah, on the other hand, had no such escape. She was forced to stay behind and face the aftermath of her choices. The next morning, the phone calls started. My parents, her sister, mutual friends, everyone wanted answers. I gave them the same response. "Ask Hannah. She knows the whole story." For the next few days, I watched her unravel. She walked around the house like a ghost, her face pale and tear-streaked. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched, knowing it was another family member or friend calling to confront her. But even as her world crumbled, I wasn't satisfied. Her tears, her regret, they weren't enough. She needed to feel the full weight of her betrayal, to know what it was like to lose everything she cared about. That's when I executed the second phase of my plan. I spent an entire evening compiling everything I had, the screenshots of her messages with Eric, the photos from her gallery, the audio recordings, and the damning videos. I organized them into a file and attached it to an email addressed to key people in her life, her boss, her closest friends, even the PTA group chat she was so proud to be a part of. The subject line was simple: "The truth about Hannah." I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the send button. Part of me wondered if I was going too far. But then I remembered the lies, the deceit, the sheer audacity of her betrayal. I clicked send. By morning, the fallout was in full swing. Hannah's phone rang nonstop. Her boss called first, demanding an explanation for the scandal now circulating through their office. Next came the PTA mothers, their once friendly tone replaced with icy judgment. By the afternoon, she had deleted her social media accounts entirely, unable to keep up with the flood of messages and comments pouring in. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked that evening, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm not doing anything to you," I replied coldly. "You did this to yourself." She tried to argue, to plead for understanding, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. The next day, her boss called again, this time to inform her that she was being placed on administrative leave. Apparently, the videos and messages had reached more people than I anticipated, and the scandal was becoming a liability for her company. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone in disbelief. "I lost my job," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Good," I said without looking up from my coffee. "Maybe now you'll understand the consequences of your actions." While Hannah was busy dealing with the public fallout, I was meeting with my lawyer to finalize my divorce filing. I didn't just want to end our marriage, I wanted to ensure she walked away with as little as possible. We filed for divorce on grounds of adultery, leveraging the overwhelming evidence I had collected. The lawyer assured me that it would work in my favor when it came to dividing assets and determining custody arrangements for Sophie. Hannah was served the papers 2 days later. She broke down sobbing when she read them, but I felt nothing. "You can't do this," she pleaded. "Please, Ryan. Don't take Sophie away from me." "I'm not taking her away," I said coldly. "But you don't deserve to raise her full-time. Not after what you've done." The truth was, I had no intention of completely cutting Hannah out of Sophie's life. But I wanted control. I wanted to ensure Sophie grew up in a stable, honest environment, something Hannah had proven incapable of providing. Just when I thought I'd heard the last of Eric, he made one final attempt to reach out. I was sitting in my office when I received an email from him. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was long and filled with excuses. He claimed he had never intended to hurt me, that his relationship with Hannah had been a mistake born out of confusion and emotional vulnerability. He begged for my forgiveness, saying he wanted to make amends. I stared at the screen, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. He wanted forgiveness? After everything he'd done? I closed the email without replying. Eric didn't deserve my forgiveness. Neither did Hannah. By the time the divorce was finalized, Hannah had lost everything: her job, her reputation, and any semblance of control over her life. The judge awarded me primary custody of Sophie, granting Hannah only limited visitation rights. The day she packed her things and left the house, she looked utterly defeated. "I loved you," she said quietly as she stood in the doorway. I didn't respond. As she drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The anger, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was still there, but it didn't control me anymore. I had taken back my power, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me again. Hannah's lies had destroyed our family. But in the end, they had only made me stronger. And as I sat in the quiet of my home that evening, watching Sophie play with her toys, I realized that I had finally won. But it didn't feel like victory. Weeks passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm. Without Hannah's presence, the house felt calmer, even if the wounds she left behind were still raw. Sophie adapted quickly. Children are resilient, after all, but I could tell she missed her mother. I did my best to keep things normal for her, even as I adjusted to life as a single parent. One evening, after Sophie was in bed, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello? Ryan, it's Eric," came the voice on the other end. I gripped the phone tightly, anger surging through me. "You've got some nerve calling me," I said, my tone cold. "Please," he said quickly. "Just hear me out. I need to talk to you. Face to face." "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, ready to hang up. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm in trouble." The word "Dad" hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, he was still my son. And the desperation in his voice made me pause. "What kind of trouble?" I asked reluctantly. He hesitated before saying, "I can't explain over the phone. Can we meet? Please?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arranged to meet the following evening at a diner on the edge of town. When I arrived at the diner, Eric was already there, sitting in a booth with a coffee in front of him. He looked terrible, disheveled, pale, and exhausted. I slid into the seat across from him, crossing my arms. "You've got 5 minutes. Talk." He fidgeted with his mug, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know where to start," he said quietly. "Start with why you thought it was okay to destroy my family," I said sharply. He winced, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. "Hannah reached out to me first. She said she was unhappy, that you were distant. I tried to push her away, but you didn't," I finished for him. He nodded, shame written all over his face. "I know I messed up, Dad. I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I didn't respond, letting the silence hang between us. Finally, he said, "But that's not why I called." "Then why did you?" He hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table to me. "What's this?" I asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Proof," he said, "of what Hannah's really been up to." I opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, images of Hannah in different places, meeting with people I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through them, a pattern began to emerge. "She's been lying to you about more than just me," Eric said quietly. One photo showed her handing an envelope to a man in a suit. Another captured her at a bank, withdrawing large sums of cash. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. "She's been embezzling money," Eric said. "From her company. That's why she reached out to me. She needed someone to cover for her, to help her move the money without raising suspicion." My blood ran cold. You're telling me she's a criminal? Eric nodded. I didn't know the full extent until recently. But now it's all catching up to her. That's why she's falling apart. She's not just losing her reputation, she's losing everything. I stared at him, my mind racing. The betrayal I'd felt before seemed almost trivial compared to this new revelation. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I'm scared, he admitted. She dragged me into this, and I don't know how to get out. I thought, maybe you'd know what to do. I leaned back in my seat, studying him. For the first time in weeks, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: sincerity. The next day, I began piecing everything together. I reviewed the photos Eric had given me, cross-referencing them with the evidence I'd already collected. It was clear Hannah's web of lies was far more intricate than I'd imagined. She wasn't just cheating. She was running a scheme. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper, and what he uncovered was even more shocking. Hannah had been embezzling funds for years, using her position at her company to funnel money into offshore accounts. The man in the suit? A known money launderer. The pieces started to fall into place. Her sudden work trips, her inexplicable purchases, the nervous energy she carried, it all made sense now. But the question was, what was I going to do about it? Hannah had destroyed our family, betrayed my trust, and now she dragged Eric into her mess. I knew I couldn't let her get away with it. I contacted my lawyer and the private investigator, laying out everything I had. Together, we formulated a plan. Hannah thought she'd escaped the worst of the fallout. She was wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent the next week preparing for what was to come. My lawyer and the private investigator worked tirelessly, collecting irrefutable evidence of Hannah's financial crimes. Meanwhile, I maintained an air of normalcy, ensuring that Hannah didn't suspect a thing. It wasn't easy. The weight of what I knew and what I was planning was like a storm cloud hanging over me. But every time I doubted myself, I thought about Sophie, about the lies Hannah had told and the chaos she'd caused. I couldn't let it go unanswered. One evening, as Hannah came to pick up Sophie for her court-ordered visitation, I played my part perfectly. "How's everything going?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Fine," she replied tersely, avoiding my gaze. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. The fallout from her ruined reputation was clearly taking its toll, but I knew she was still holding on to whatever shred of control she thought she had. "Glad to hear it," I said, smiling faintly. "Take care of Sophie. See you Sunday." She nodded, took Sophie's hand, and left without another word. Once they were gone, I made the call. "It's time," I told the private investigator. The next morning, I sat in my lawyer's office as we finalized the details of the report we were sending to the authorities. The private investigator had uncovered enough to build a solid case against Hannah, including detailed financial records, bank statements, and evidence of her connections to the money launderer. "It's airtight," my lawyer said, handing me the final draft. "Once we submit this, there's no turning back." "Good," I replied, signing the necessary documents. By the end of the day, the report had been delivered to the police and Hannah's former employer. I knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences caught up with her. 2 days later it happened. I was in the kitchen, preparing lunch for Sophie, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. "Local executive under investigation for embezzlement and fraud." I opened the article, my heart racing. There it was, Hannah's name in bold letters, her photo accompanying the headline. The article detailed the allegations against her, including the evidence that had been submitted to the authorities. By the time she called me, I was ready. "You did this!" she screamed into the phone, her voice shaking with rage. "I did what needed to be done," I replied coldly. "You brought this on yourself, Hannah. Don't forget that." "They're going to ruin me," she sobbed. "Do you even care what this will do to Sophie? Don't you dare use her as an excuse," I snapped. "You weren't thinking about Sophie when you lied, cheated, and stole. This is all on you." She hung up, and I knew I wouldn't hear from her again anytime soon. A week later, the private investigator called me with one last piece of information, something I hadn't been prepared for. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The offshore accounts Hannah was funneling money into? They weren't just hers." "What do you mean?" I asked, a sinking feeling in my stomach. "They were joint accounts," he explained. "Hannah set them up with Eric." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The betrayal I thought I'd already fully uncovered had another layer, a deeper, more calculated scheme than I could have imagined. "She used him," I said finally, my voice low. "Yes," the investigator confirmed. "But he didn't just go along with it. He actively participated. They were in this together." I felt the anger rise again, but this time it wasn't just directed at Hannah. Eric had claimed he was dragged into her mess, that he was a victim. But now I knew the truth. He wasn't just complicit, he was a partner in her crimes. The investigator's voice interrupted my thoughts. "The authorities are going to investigate him as well. You might want to prepare for that." "Let them," I said, my voice cold. The next day, I called Eric and told him to meet me at the diner again. He arrived looking nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected the police to burst in at any moment. "What's this about?" he asked as he slid into the booth. "I know about the accounts," I said bluntly. His face went pale. "Dad, Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't lie to me again." He slumped in his seat, his hands trembling. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said quietly. "She said it was just a way to keep some extra money safe. I didn't know." "Don't insult my intelligence," I said. "You knew exactly what you were doing. And now you're going to face the consequences." He looked up at me, tears in his eyes. "Please, Dad. I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "Stop," I said, my voice cold. "You're not my son anymore. Not after this." I stood up, leaving him sitting there, alone and defeated. Within weeks, both Hannah and Eric were charged with embezzlement and fraud. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and there was no escape. As the legal proceedings unfolded, I focused on rebuilding my life. Sophie and I moved to a new house, far away from the memories of betrayal and heartbreak. I started a new job, made new friends, and created a life where Hannah and Eric were nothing more than a painful chapter in my past. And when the verdict finally came, guilty on all counts, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. They had taken everything from me. And I had taken everything from them. But as I stood in my new home, watching Sophie play in the backyard, I realized something. Revenge might not bring peace, but it does bring justice. And justice was enough. The months following the trial were a strange mix of quiet and chaos. With Hannah and Eric out of the picture, my focus shifted entirely to Sophie. She was the one constant in my life, the one thing that made me feel like I hadn't completely lost everything. But rebuilding wasn't easy. Everywhere I went, there were whispers. Friends, neighbors, even casual acquaintances seemed to know the story. The scandal had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond our immediate circle. Some people were supportive, offering kind words and encouragement. Others, not so much. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public. And though I had taken action to expose the truth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still living under its shadow. One afternoon, as Sophie played with her toys, I received an unexpected call. "Hello? Mr. Ryan Cole?" The voice was firm, professional. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Detective Marshall with the Financial Crimes Unit. I wanted to let you know that we've closed the case against Hannah Cole and Eric Cole. Both have been sentenced to serve time." "How long?" I asked, my voice steady. "Hannah received 8 years due to the scale of the embezzlement. Eric was sentenced to 5 years, as his involvement was less substantial but still criminally significant." I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the news sink in. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. The detective paused. "Mr. Cole, I've handled a lot of cases like this, but yours was unique. If you don't mind me saying, you handled it with a level of control I rarely see." I didn't respond. Control? It hadn't felt like control. It had felt like survival. A few weeks later, I received a knock on the door. Sophie was napping, and I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened it cautiously. Standing on the porch was Hannah's mother. "Janice," I said, my voice betraying my surprise. "Ryan," she replied, her tone weary. "May I come in?" I hesitated before stepping aside. Janice had always been a kind woman, but she hadn't spoken to me since the scandal broke. I assumed she was ashamed of her daughter's actions, or perhaps ashamed of herself for not seeing the truth sooner. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly. "I'm not here to defend her," she began. "I know what Hannah did was unforgivable. But I needed to talk to you." "What about?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Sophie," she said, her voice breaking. "Hannah, she's struggling in prison. The one thing that keeps her going is the thought of Sophie. She's asked me to visit her and bring updates about her daughter. Pictures, letters, anything." I tensed, the thought of Hannah trying to insert herself back into Sophie's life making my stomach churn. "She forfeited her right to Sophie when she chose to lie and cheat," I said coldly. "I understand," Janice said, her voice soft. "But she's still Sophie's mother." "She's nothing to Sophie now," I replied. "I won't let her poison Sophie's life the way she poisoned mine." Janice nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I had to ask," she said quietly. "For her sake." I didn't respond, and after a few moments of silence she stood up and left. Over the next few months, I focused on creating a new life for Sophie and me. We moved to a new neighborhood where no one knew our story, and I started a new job that kept me busy but gave me plenty of time to spend with her. I enrolled Sophie in a preschool with a strong sense of community, and she quickly made friends. Watching her laugh and play, so full of life, gave me hope that we could move past the darkness. As for me, I started going to therapy, a step I'd resisted for a long time. At first, it felt strange to open up to a stranger about the pain and betrayal I'd experienced. But over time, I realized it wasn't just about the past. It was about learning to let go of the anger and find a way forward. One day, my therapist asked me, "Do you feel like you've forgiven them, Hannah and Eric?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," I said honestly. "But I don't need to. I just need to move on." And that's what I did. A year after the trial, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was from the prison where Hannah was serving her sentence. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a handwritten note. "Ryan, I don't expect you to read this, let alone respond. But I need you to know how sorry I am. Not for the consequences, those are mine to bear, but for the pain I caused you and Sophie. You didn't deserve any of this. And I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me someday. Take care of Sophie. She's lucky to have you. Hannah." I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions conflicted. It didn't change anything, but for the first time, I felt a small flicker of closure. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if I'd ever read it again. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving forward. Sophie and I had found a rhythm, a sense of normalcy that I hadn't thought possible a year ago. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me with her big, curious eyes. "Daddy, are you happy?" she asked. I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm getting there, sweetheart," I said. "I'm getting there." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of pain, but it never erases it completely. 2 years had passed since Hannah and Eric had been sentenced, and life had settled into a new kind of normal for Sophie and me. Sophie was thriving. She'd started kindergarten, made friends, and developed a personality that was equal parts curious and fearless. She was the light in my life, the one thing that reminded me every day why I'd fought so hard to protect her from the chaos Hannah had caused. But the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it. One evening, as I was going through old paperwork, I stumbled across a folder I hadn't seen in years. Inside were photographs of my life before the betrayal, vacations with Hannah, birthdays, holidays, and even pictures of Eric as a teenager. I stared at the photos, the memories tugging at something deep inside me. There was a time when we'd all been happy, or at least I thought we were. Looking at those frozen moments, I couldn't help but wonder, were the smiles real, or were they just masks hiding the cracks that would eventually destroy us? I thought about throwing the folder away but decided against it. Instead, I tucked it back into the drawer and closed it. Some things are better left buried. About a month later, I received a call from Janice, Hannah's mother. I hadn't spoken to her since she came to my house after the trial, and I was surprised to hear from her again. "Ryan," she said, her voice hesitant. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but there's something you should know." "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "It's Hannah," she said quietly. "She's not doing well in prison. She's been asking to see you." I felt a surge of anger. Why would I want to see her? She destroyed everything. "I know," Janice said. "And I don't expect you to forgive her. But she's asking for closure. She says she needs to explain herself to you." "I don't need her explanations," I replied coldly. "I know everything I need to know." There was a long pause before Janice said, "Think about it, Ryan. That's all I'm asking." I hung up without answering. For the next few days, her words lingered in my mind. Part of me wanted to confront Hannah, to see her face the consequences of her actions up close. But another part of me, one I wasn't ready to admit, was curious. What could she possibly say that she hadn't already? Against my better judgment, I agreed to see her. I arranged a visit through her prison counselor, who assured me it would be a strictly monitored conversation. The day of the visit, I felt a mix of anger and dread as I drove to the prison. When I entered the visitation room, I saw her sitting at a small table, wearing a plain beige jumpsuit. She looked older, thinner, her once vibrant face now etched with lines of guilt and exhaustion. "Ryan," she said softly as I sat across from her. I didn't respond, keeping my expression cold and unreadable. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would." "Get to the point," I said flatly. Her eyes welled with tears, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did," she began. "And I know saying I'm sorry doesn't change anything. But I need you to know, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about control." I frowned, leaning back in my chair. "Control?" She nodded. "My whole life, I felt like I was never good enough, for my job, for you, for myself. When Eric came back into my life, he gave me something I didn't even realize I wanted. Power. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep everything separate. But I was wrong." I stared at her, my anger simmering. "So what? You're blaming your insecurities for ruining our family? For dragging our son into a criminal scheme?" Her voice broke. "I'm not blaming anyone but myself. I was selfish. I thought I could have it all, and I didn't care who got hurt in the process." For a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I thought I knew. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of everything she'd done. "Do you know what you took from me?" I asked, my voice low. "You didn't just betray me, you destroyed the life we built." "And for what?" "A fleeting sense of power?" She sobbed quietly, unable to meet my gaze. "I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make peace with that." I stood up, unable to stomach her tears any longer. "You don't get to make peace with it. You live with it. Just like I have to." As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief. Seeing her like that, broken, remorseful, didn't erase the pain, but it dulled its edge. For the first time in years, I felt like I could truly leave her behind. After the visit, I decided to focus entirely on the life I was building with Sophie. We started new traditions: Sunday morning pancakes, trips to the park, and movie nights where she always insisted on picking the film. I also started dating again, cautiously dipping my toe into the idea of letting someone new into my life. It wasn't easy. Trust didn't come naturally anymore, and I was careful to protect Sophie from anyone I wasn't sure about. But slowly, I began to open up. One evening, as Sophie and I sat on the couch watching her favorite cartoon, she turned to me and said, "Daddy, are we happy?" I smiled, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "We're happy." And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. The ghosts of the past would always be there, but they no longer controlled me. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but it was mine to walk. And that was enough. Life had finally settled into a peaceful rhythm. Sophie was growing into a bright, happy child, and my heart swelled with pride every time I saw her laugh or succeed in something new. I'd started seeing someone, Claire, a kind and grounded woman who brought a quiet warmth to my life. She was good with Sophie, patient with me, and most importantly, honest. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly moving forward. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was junk. But something about the weight of it caught my attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed and unsigned. "Ryan, you thought you knew everything. But you've only scratched the surface. A friend." Attached to the letter was a small flash drive. My stomach churned as I stared at it, the peaceful bubble of my new life suddenly feeling fragile. Against my better judgment, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop and opened the single file it contained. It was a video. The footage was grainy, taken from a hidden camera. At first, I couldn't make sense of it: a dimly lit room, muffled voices. Then the picture sharpened, and I saw two familiar faces: Hannah and Eric. It wasn't one of their casual meetings or a private moment. This was something else entirely. They were sitting across from a man in a suit, the same man from the photographs I'd received earlier, the money launderer. "Everything is set," the man said, his voice low. "The accounts are secure. But you need to understand, if this blows up, you'll both go down. Are you prepared for that?" Eric glanced at Hannah, his jaw tight. "We'll be fine," he said. The video ended abruptly, but it left me reeling. This wasn't just about money or betrayal. Hannah and Eric had knowingly entered into a criminal partnership, aware of the risks and consequences. And yet they had gone through with it anyway, dragging our family into the fallout. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Who had sent the letter? And why now, after all this time? Unable to shake the questions, I decided to visit Eric in prison. It was a decision I wrestled with for days, but in the end, I needed answers. When I arrived, Eric looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. Prison had aged him, his once confident demeanor replaced with a hollow, defeated air. "Dad?" he said, surprised to see me. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Who else was involved?" I asked, my voice cold. His face paled. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the letter from my pocket and slid it across the table. "This. Someone sent me this, along with a video of you and Hannah meeting with the money launderer. Care to explain?" He stared at the letter, his hands trembling. "I don't know who sent this," he said quietly. "Don't lie to me, Eric," I snapped. "I deserve the truth." He hesitated, then sighed heavily. "There was someone else. A silent partner. They helped set up the accounts, provided the connections. But we never met them in person." "Who?" I demanded. Eric shook his head. "I don't know. Hannah might, but I don't." I leaned back, the weight of his words sinking in. This silent partner was still out there, a shadow lingering over everything. As I left the prison, a sense of unease settled over me. The flash drive and the cryptic letter weren't just reminders of the past, they were warnings. Someone wanted me to know that the story wasn't over. and though I had no intention of reopening old wounds, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the peace I'd fought so hard to build might not last. I chose not to tell Claire about the letter or the video. There was no point in dragging her into the darkness I had spent so long escaping. Instead, I focused on Sophie, on my work, on the small joys that had come to define my new life. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and Sophie was asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The past might have been buried, but its ghost still lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. For now, I would keep moving forward, one step at a time. But I would also keep looking over my shoulder. Because some betrayals never truly end.